I'm going to be talking about sort of a long thread of my work on natural regeneration of tropical forests and putting this in the context of the urgent need for large-scale restoration and conservation globally. And first, I'd like to suggest that we think about restoration and recovery in two different ways. And I come into contact with these two views very often. One view sees restoration as an effort of human agency. It's what people do. And this idea is often expressed as a responsibility to fix the damage that we have brought onto ecosystems. And it's the damage that we caused, so it's our responsibility to restore them and to fix them. And fixing ecosystems and restoring ecosystems is our job. And the main implication of this view is that the restoration process is really governed by human actions. But I also often hear, and I actually am more attracted to this other view, which is that restoration is really a natural recovery process, and it's what ecosystems do. It's how ecosystems heal from disturbances, and it's a natural process that all ecosystems undergo, and they've been undergoing this process long before humans were on the scene. And that this type of recovery can be accelerated and guided and molded by specific interventions and treatments, but that the restoration process is essentially governed by natural processes. And it's not like these are both right or wrong, but I think that when we start to see these different perspectives, we can see how restoration has taken on different approaches. And certainly the urgent need for restoration, especially in forest ecosystems, has led to this feeling that we just have to just plant trees everywhere. That this is our way out. This is how we solve this problem. By we remove the trees, and it's our job to put them back. And you can see here just a sample of some of the many organizations working around the world. But in fact, we don't need to plant trees everywhere. And I want to leave you with the impression after this presentation that there are other approaches to how ecosystems can undergo restoration. And the one that is most near and dear to my heart is natural regeneration, or basically forest succession, which is occurring all over the world in forest ecosystems and in many other types of ecosystems as well. My research has been predominantly in Costa Rica, where for many years we've been studying the recovery of natural forests and lands that were cleared, converted to pastures, and then for a variety of reasons were left to regrow naturally. They were either purchased to be part of a field station, or the farmer decided to create an ecotourism operation, or they simply just didn't use the land anymore, and it started growing back. So what we've discovered is that this process can be very, very successful as a restoration process. And it really wasn't viewed as restoration. It was just viewed as an ecological process. And what I've been trying to do over the past few years is to really integrate our knowledge from natural regeneration into the efforts to restore ecosystems. And this graph is just showing the basal area increases in these forest plots over time. So we've learned a lot from just studying these 1 hectare plots in Costa Rica over 20 years. And I'm just going to summarize a little in a brief way some of the things we've learned. First, we found that the successional pathways are really variable, but there's a lot of predictability in them, in that we see predictable patterns of species turnover and of the types of life history and demography that we see shifts over time, which are species specific. And these demographic changes and the trace of species really drive successional change, ecosystem change. And many of these aspects are also phylogenetically conserved. So there's another interesting side to the story in terms of the evolutionary perspectives. We also have found, along with many other studies, that different types of processes recover at different rates. And we often see, for example, species richness recovers quickly, but species composition recovers very slowly. The changes in tree species richness are very complex, and they're distinct. When you look at a successional pathway, they're distinct from what you see in many cases with a chronosequence, which is just a single point in time where you have a space for time substitution and you look at plots of different age. So often the inferences you get from those on tree species richness are different from what you see when you look at individual plots over time. And then finally, we found that the forest succession really sort of has its own set of rules, and it occasionally gives us a little peek into what those rules are, but that it really is a very, very protracted process that takes place gradually over decades and centuries. And the idea that a forest can grow back, you know, even within our lifetimes is just really not accurate. We need to really view this as a very long-term process and see the progress in forest changes, you know, with this perspective of a very gradual change. We have begun to pull data together from a range of different studies. This is one of our first papers with a network of secondary forest plots in the Neotropics. And what we're finding is that there are a lot of patterns that are driven by climate and by rainfall. In this example, total rainfall is a strong predictor of the accumulation of above ground biomass. And here it was measured at a 20-year period to standardize for successional time, because we see huge changes over time. And so rainfall is a big driver of the rate of accumulation of biomass. And we also find that these different patterns of biomass recovery are basically linked to different amounts of rainfall. These would be dry forests, these would be seasonal forests, and these would be evergreen forests here for the most part. So both absolute recovery and percentage recovery are driven, particularly the absolute recovery is more driven by rainfall patterns. In terms of the species composition and species richness, we also find a fairly rapid recovery of species richness, but these are not necessarily the same groups of species that you find in an old growth forest. And that recovery takes a much longer period of time. We also found that this rate of increase of species richness is greater with greater water availability. And the relative recovery, that is compared to an old growth forest, is related to the forest cover in the surrounding landscape. So there's both climate drivers and landscape drivers, as well as other within site factors that are all influencing the successional patterns. Recently, I was able to participate in a global study that looked at rates of carbon storage above ground during the first 30 years of natural regeneration. And what we found in this study was the variation was over 100-fold across different regions of the world. And you can see here the dark green are the areas with the highest accumulation rate of carbon in above ground biomass. So wetter tropical forests, again, are those where we find the most rapid carbon storage during these first 30 years. And this study also looked at specifically those areas where there's a high potential. These are restoration opportunities. They're forest ecosystems that were cleared and have the potential, I'm sorry, I don't know why that's doing, potential for a restoration. So we can actually look at where restoration would have the greatest benefits for carbon storage. And we can also, using other sources of data, look for other types of benefits for restoration in terms of looking at maybe where priority areas are, or for planning within a country where you might want to target areas for carbon storage. We also are beginning to appreciate more and more all of the different ecosystem services that natural regenerating forests can provide. So also the regulation of water flows and reducing flooding, reducing temperature of air and keeping it cooler, ameliorating climate change, providing food for wildlife and habitat, providing timber and firewood and a range of other non-timber forest products, providing resources for pollinators and frugivores, improving water quality in water bodies, the scenic value for ecotourism and recreation, and improving soil quality and reducing erosion. So these are all in addition to the accumulation of carbon, storage of carbon. And in addition to these ecosystem services, forest regeneration also supports local knowledge and cultural practices, which developed over many centuries that were based on the forest regeneration cycle, and the different products that were available during different stages of restoration, and how different species would indicate improvements in soil fertility, for example, for shifting cultivation. It builds on and reinforces ecological memory, both within sites and within the landscape. So natural regeneration can also create a stock of species that can then help to restore at a much larger scale. These forests also have a high potential for management and for enhancing particular composition or products. And because nature is doing most of the work here, or all of the work, there's a potential for restoring much larger areas of forest because we're not restricted by costs. Rather, the restrictions are more at a different scale. I'll get to that in a minute. So there are many advantages of natural regeneration. And some studies recently have, through meta-analysis, found that there also are better outcomes of natural regeneration compared to active or planted forest restoration. And these range from biodiversity to vegetation structure, and not just plant diversity, but a range of animal groups as well. So given what we know, it seems like there are many strong arguments that you could make for undertaking or letting nature undertake its own restoration through natural processes. But we find that there are lots of barriers. So not all situations and contexts and locations are good places for natural regeneration, and we simply don't see natural regeneration in many regions. Here I'm focusing mostly on tropical and subtropical regions. And so these barriers come in two main categories. On the left are biophysical variables, and on the right are socioeconomic variables. And the biophysical variables are ones that we're generally familiar with: limited seed dispersal, poor establishment, poor soil quality. Areas may be prone to fire. There may be grazers and herbivores that affect the vegetation recovery, and invasive species can also be very important in impeding a native recovery and establishment of native species. On the socioeconomic side, there also is a long list of barriers. Many people view natural regeneration as disorderly, uncontrolled. It has unpredictable outcomes. So if you want a particular result in a particular number of years, it may argue against allowing natural regeneration. There may be undesirable or low value species that are proliferating. The economic benefits may be relatively low for farmers or landowners. and it may appear as the land is abandoned or poorly managed, and it could attract threatening wildlife as well that you don't want on your farm. So these are real and important barriers that are sometimes too great to overcome, and mean that other kinds of restoration, other approaches are more relevant and more suitable. But I think if we think about the potential of natural regeneration as being something that we could assess, we really have a lever here that we can use to move the world, as Archimedes said. We can use natural regeneration as a way to leverage large-scale forest restoration. An example of how this can be done is in Brazil, in the Atlantic forest. I was able to work with this group at the International Institute for Sustainability. This particular paper was led by Renato Cruzeles, and it involved using historical data on land use change from 1996 to 2015 within this whole region of the Atlantic forest. And the study looked at how much natural forest regeneration occurred during this 20-year period. And you can see here the green areas. This is an example from one area. The green polygons are intact forest fragments, and the brown areas are natural regeneration. Many of them are bordering these fragments. So that's a clue to one factor that's really important. But we found in this particular case, over 2.7 million hectares of forest recovered through natural regeneration. This was removing any areas that were planted, either commercial or regeneration plantings, all natural regeneration. So that's a pretty substantial gain of tree cover without very much cost. So based on this information, we did an analysis to understand what environmental factors best predicted where natural regeneration occurred. So it predicted the presence or absence of natural regeneration. We did this at the municipality level, and we also did this at the pixel level. And one of the main results was the proximity to forest was the most important factor. 90% of the cases where forest regenerated naturally were less than 200 meters of the edge of a forest area. And that could be a small forest fragment. It didn't have to be a large forest area. So that's one clue as to a major factor, at least within this region, that was associated with natural regeneration. And then we took that information and made a predictive model looking into the future. And of course, we had to assume that the conditions and factors driving natural regeneration would be the same in the next 20 years as they were in the past 20 years, which may or may not be the case. But that's one of the constraints of using these kinds of predictive models. But our model predicted another 2.8 million hectares could undergo natural regeneration by 2035. And another large area amount, almost 19 million hectares, had a moderate prediction of capacity for natural regeneration. So those could be restored using some kind of assisted natural regeneration approach. You would not have to do a complete tree planting. And if this were adopted across the entire Atlantic forest region, we could reduce the costs by 77%, or $90 billion, comparing that to what it would cost to do full tree planting across this region. So we have an example here where understanding the factors that drive natural regeneration could be used to predict where it's most likely in the future and to plan where it's necessary to do active restoration and where assisted natural regeneration could be a very effective restoration approach. So this map was then presented to the Environment Ministry in Brazil to use in their spatial planning of restoration within the entire Atlantic forest region. And this is just one example of how understanding the ecological and biophysical constraints can can really help understand the future potential and can be included within spatial planning efforts, so that money can be spent much more effectively by targeting these areas in pink in this graph where active restoration would be needed, where there's a very low potential for the forest to recover on its own. And in the blue areas where there's a moderate to high potential for the forest to recover on their own. So we got excited about this approach and of course wanted to conquer the world. So the next thing we did was to address the question of global potential for natural regeneration within the tropics and subtropics. So we had a similar time frame here. It was from 2000 to 2016, where the assessment was made of where natural regeneration occurred. And this was a collaborative project that was supported by Conservation International and then was conducted by the International Institute for Sustainability, the Australia branch, which I'm also involved in. And this really used a data set that Matt Fagan and his colleagues put together using a long-term information on forest gain and forest loss from the Hansen lab, the GLAD lab at the University of Maryland. And this is based on high resolution data, 30 meters. And the forest gain from that study was used and filtered to eliminate areas that were known to be plantations. And this took several years to do this confidently and get records on where plantations were all over the tropics and subtropics. When that work was done, we got a map of where natural regeneration occurred within those years across the global tropics and subtropics. And then our modeling process, once we identified those areas, was to develop and validate models that identified which covariates were associated with sites where natural regeneration occurred, and which were associated with sites where it could have occurred but didn't. So that was part of our second step. And then we applied this model to make spatial predictions about the potential for natural regeneration in the future. And we considered as sites that underwent natural regeneration areas that persisted as forests for at least 3 years and had at least 5 contiguous pixels. So we weren't seeing sites blinking in and out. We were really looking for longer term and larger scale trends that we picked up. So we're preparing this paper now, and I just share some of our results with you in terms of where we found how much natural regeneration we found. And we found over the 16-year period, a total of 5.4 million hectares across the global tropics and subtropics that we could attribute to natural regeneration. And that compared to over 11 million hectares that we attributed to plantations. So it's about double the area that was in plantations. But still, it's a very substantial amount here, 5.4 million hectares. And these were some of the variables that we used to make our model of where natural regeneration occurred, including biophysical variables. And here we include soil variables and bioclimatic variables because we had a global data set with a lot of variation, a much more variation than we had in the Atlantic forest case. And we also included in this study several socioeconomic variables that we were able to get for the global extent. And what we found is that the best predictors, first of all, we found that when we had models that included both socioeconomic and biophysical variables, they were very similar in their accuracy to models that were only based on the biophysical variables, which was actually a relief for us because we felt that for projecting into the future, having something that was based on biophysical variables would be more reliable than using socioeconomic variables that are definitely much more susceptible to change from year to year. So even though we had some socioeconomic variables that were included in the predictors, we did not need to use those in our predictions of future regeneration capacity. And we found 3 variables that were the best ones. There were several others that were important. The most important ones were the local density of forest, the distance to the nearest forest, 2 soil variables, and 4 variables about bioclimate based on a principal components analysis. We also found land use cover and biome were important predictors. And here's just some of the results for those 3 important ones that I mentioned. The potential for the predicted probability of natural regeneration increased with the density of forest in the surrounding area and with soil organic carbon. And it decreased with distance to forest. So this was a particular finding that we had in Brazil as well. So these are all variables that can be mapped and can be used to predict where natural regeneration potential would be high. So using our predictive model, we actually predicted that over the next 16 years, natural regeneration could occur over 238 million hectares in the tropics and subtropics. And that Brazil and Indonesia accounted for 1/3 of that global potential. And but there were 36 countries that each had areas of over 1 million hectares each that would be suitable for natural regeneration, at least from the biophysical side. So here's just some of our results. This is for the New World tropics. We found 100 meters. I'm sorry, my name label is covering it up. 100 million hectares of potential natural regeneration. This was the highest from our global prediction. In the Asian region, we found 100. And in the African region, only 28. So there's a lower overall potential that we found in Africa. Now, some of you are probably wondering, what about India? And I'll get to that in a moment. I just wanted to highlight that Brazil was the #1 and showing a potential of 49 million hectares, which is way, way above its bond challenge commitment. So in fact, they could achieve almost all of that with natural regeneration if they wanted to. So India, I wanted to include something about that because we are developing a spatial planning platform for restoration through this We Plan Forests effort, which is part of the IIS Australia. And we have, from this global analysis of restoration costs and benefits, we have been able to look across the world at countries in tropics and subtropics. We're not including the non-tropical parts of these geographies. It's just our models aren't effective outside of the tropics. But for India, for example, the We Plan Forest domain area is 151 million hectares. And in that area, we calculated the area available for forest restoration is almost 22 million hectares. And again, this doesn't include the non-tropical, subtropical parts. And this is what the map of potential for natural regeneration looks like for the subtropics and tropics of India. And only forest biomes are included here. So these would be grassland areas that we did not include in our model. And you can see here areas that are probably familiar to some of you in the Western Ghats that have a very high potential for natural regeneration, as well as some areas over here and also in Bangladesh and Myanmar. So this is we offer this as information that can be used for further research and for planning where particular kinds of restoration interventions might be more useful and more effective. And when it comes to assisted natural regeneration, this is really about removing those barriers that I mentioned earlier. So some of those may be biophysical variables, and some of those may be socioeconomic variables. Our map could tell you which areas have a high biophysical potential. And then it would be important to consider some of these socioeconomic barriers as the next stage. And where is it more likely that some of these socioeconomic barriers could be removed in order to allow natural regeneration to occur. Also, assisted natural regeneration is a very flexible approach and can be used in a variety of contexts. For example, in conservation areas, assisted natural regeneration can be used to accelerate and enrich forest regeneration in areas that were heavily degraded, grasslands or shrublands, or where there's been invasion of exotic species, and that's the main barrier. Removing those species or controlling them may make a big difference in promoting natural regeneration. There's also the potential to use assisted natural regeneration as a part of forest management. So where you actually have a plan to harvest trees in the future, and you want to enrich the forest with particular species, or favor through silviculture, favor the dominance and growth of certain species. And it can also be used as a component of agriculture, as it's being used in very many parts of Africa and sub-Saharan Sahel, where you have the growth of farmer-managed natural regeneration and the nurturing of trees from resprouts and pruning efforts to allow trees to regrow in areas where they have been removed, but where the soil was not plowed and there's still propagules in the ground. And also exclosures are important ways of allowing natural regeneration and fodder reserves as well. So like other kinds of natural restoration, we can look at the particular enabling conditions for assisted natural regeneration. And some of these could also be mapped and combined with some of the biophysical enabling conditions. So for example, you'd want to look for areas where there was a sufficient density of existing seedlings, tree seedlings that were coming in, and where there were sources for seed or resprouts. Also, it's important to minimize human disturbances, at least particularly early on in the process. And you also want to be able to provide incentives and benefits so that local communities can participate in and receive some kinds of payments or economic benefits. And it really helps to have a vision at least among local stakeholders within the community, that this is something that they want. And obviously having clear land and resource tenure are very important, because to reap the benefits of natural regeneration, farmers need to be able to enjoy the economic returns and to claim those as their own. And so that's why we need favorable policy and regulatory environments for restoration in general. And we also really need to work on the side of capacity building and technical knowledge and support, because these have been focused very much on forestry and not so much on natural regeneration. And there's potential for enlisting technical support for specifically focused on helping farmers to foster natural regeneration on their lands. So in conclusion, I would just say here that we have shown that in many cases, tropical forests can and do recover with little or no human assistance, and that this can provide a cost-effective nature-based solution that helps to achieve both restoration and conservation. And we can apply some of this knowledge to decision support tools using spatial data that can help to inform what areas are most likely, where we could target natural regeneration approaches or assisted natural regeneration approaches based on certain biophysical predictors and knowledge of enabling conditions, the ones that I was just mentioning. And I think it's also important, even though we're not saying, we can't guarantee that, this, because this pixel has a high natural regeneration potential, that natural regeneration would really happen there. These kinds of model predictions really provide important insights in how we can support decision-making using spatial planning, and particularly for cost-effective forest recovery across the tropics and subtropics. And this planning is probably most effective at national and subnational scales, where you can get the fine-grained spatial information for these enabling factors and biophysical conditions. And finally, but not least, the socioeconomic factors present the strongest limitations to natural regeneration of tropical and subtropical forests. We have found this potential for 238 million hectares, but in the last 16 years, only 5.4 million hectares actually did undergo natural regeneration. So the potential is much, much higher than what we have actually seen, which suggests that we need to really rethink a lot of the policies that we have in place if we want to harness and leverage this potential to bring about the large scale restoration that we hope we can have to help save our planet. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.